notre webinaire ce soir. Alors, bienvenue. Mon nom est Nathalie Côté. Je suis la directrice agronomique aux producteurs de bovins du Québec. Ça me fait plaisir de vous accueillir au webinaire intitulé « Le bœuf canadien, chef de file en durabilité ». Alors, ce soir, on va avoir une conférencière qui est anglophone. Alors, on va vous expliquer les consignes pour bien être capable d'avoir la traduction. Fait que je vais demander à Cyrine de nous parler de toutes les options qu'il y a dans le bas de votre écran.
Oui. Bonsoir à tous. Donc, ce soir, pour que vous puissiez comprendre tout puis vous faciliter la vie, on a un interprète qui est avec nous ce soir. Donc, ce qui se passe, si vous voulez pouvoir avoir la version française, en fait, dans le bas de votre écran, vous avez un espèce de petit globe là, qui s'appelle Interprétation. Il vous suffit de cliquer dessus et ensuite, vous avez plusieurs options. Vous avez audio original. Dans le fond, vous resterez dans cette pièce puis vous en écouterez que ce soit de l'anglais ou du français. Ou sinon, vous sélectionnez la langue que vous voulez entendre. Donc, si vous voulez entendre du français, vous cliquez sur français et là, vous entendrez en direct donc l'interprète qui fera la traduction de la présentation d'aujourd'hui. Si vous avez des questions par rapport à ça, n'hésitez pas à aller dans le fil de discussion qui est aussi en bas de votre écran, puis on tentera de vous aider pour comprendre le mécanisme.
Parfait. Juste peut-être pour préciser, on va comme à l'habitude, ouvrir la période de questions à la fin de la conférence. Mais si jamais vous avez des questions tout au long de la présentation, vous pouvez toujours aller les inscrire dans le Q&A ou Q&A, si vous avez la version anglaise. Fait à ce moment-là, on va les reprendre, nous, à la fin pour que le conférencier puisse répondre à vos questions. Donc, en parlant de conférence, alors ce soir, nous accueillons Mme Brenna Grant, qui a une maîtrise et un bac en agronomie. Elle est la directrice exécutive de CANFAX et CANFAX Service. Et on sera en support à Mme Grant, il y aura moi-même, Nathalie Côté, et Cyrine Elle Amdoui, que vous venez d'entendre. J'aimerais rappeler, avant de débuter la présentation, que la soirée est rendue possible grâce aux producteurs de bovins, au réseau Agri-Conseil ainsi qu'au programme VBP+. Alors, à ce moment-ci, je vais partir la présentation de Mme Grant. Alors, vous voyez tout le monde bien la présentation et je vais passer la parole à Brenna.
Thank you, Natalie. It is a pleasure to be with you all tonight. And I'm really excited to talk about sustainability, the Canadian goals, and how we plan to get there as an industry together. The report on livestock's long shadow was published in 2006, and yet we continue to feel its impacts today as it has colored conversations about the global beef industry ever since. One of the things that's been critical in communications is that global averages do not apply to Canada or many other countries around the world. On the next slide, you're going to see that globally, cattle are the main contributor to the livestock sector's emissions at about 5 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalents, which represents about 62% of the sector's emissions. But on the right-hand side, you can see that emissions intensity for beef ranges widely. You have countries that have high emissions, and you have countries that have very low emissions. And so we need to be careful that we don't lump all of beef together in saying it's all bad. You can see that compared to other livestock emissions, that beef countries that have low emissions intensity can actually be very competitive with other protein options. And it should be noted on that right-hand side, all of those commodities are expressed on a per protein basis in order to make them comparable. So on the next slide, we see that the main emissions from cattle are enteric methane, but that portion really varies based on production systems. Globally, it's about 44% of total emissions, but in Canada, it's 51%. Our next largest emissions come from manure management at 28% and feed production at 19%. And so we need to recognize that when we talk about strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, that because of these differences in where emissions come from in each country, those strategies for mitigation are going to look different in one region to another or one country to another. So next we have some studies globally that show that it's estimated that mitigation options could provide approximately 33% reduction, or about 2.5 gigatons removed from the global emissions with respect to the baseline scenario. This figure arises from the assumption that producers in a given system, region, or ecozone would be able to apply practices of the 10th percentile of producers that have the lowest emissions while maintaining constant output and production, and therefore continuing to supply beef to consumers. And so we know that there are variations regionally, and that's why it's so important that we get the local context. On the next slide, we see the breakdown of what our situation here is in Canada, where agriculture, both livestock and crops combined, represent 8% of our country's emissions. This is significantly less than emissions from transport at 30%. And this pie chart for Canada looks very different from the US, where their emissions from agriculture are much larger due to their acres that they have under agricultural production. On the next slide, we can see that in the Canadian context, our emissions intensity is about half of the global average. And not only that, but we're only 2.4% of total Canadian greenhouse gas emissions. So previously we said agriculture was 8%, while the beef industry is only 2.4%. And it's not like we've been staying stagnant. Between 1981 and 2011, emissions intensity in Canada has reduced by 15% due to improvements in production practices. But we also need to remember that greenhouse gas emissions are not the only part of the story. On the next slide, you're going to see that the Canadian Roundtable of Sustainable Beef publishes their National Beef Sustainability Assessment. And yes, this evaluates environmental impact, but it also looks at the benefits from land use as well as social and economic assessments. This study is updated every 5 to 7 years, and there will be an update coming out next year. But it's one where, when we think about the positives of beef production, beef cattle in Canada utilize about 1/3 of agricultural land, but that land provides 2/3 of the wildlife habitat capacity that comes from agricultural landscapes. We also know that crops and cattle are integrated. So when you have a crop that is unsuitable for human consumption, it can be fed to livestock. And so that's a valuable service of upcycling that happens within the agricultural community. We also preserve carbon in lands that are managed by beef cattle and are not plowed. And that is something that we want to continue to do. But we also have other measures around water footprint that we are continuing to work on as well. So on the next slide, you're going to see that the Canadian Beef Advisors, which are made up of the 7 national beef organizations, had developed the National Beef Strategy, and they updated it for the 2024 period. But they've now taken the next step to define long-term goals for industry going out to 2030. And the intention was to set ambitious and realistic goals. These are designed to be stretch goals, that push industry to strive for something that we would not achieve if we didn't have these goals. So next, we see what outcomes that we wanted to achieve with those goals. Specifically, we wanted them to be science-based, measurable, improvable, and reportable. We wanted the public to be able to see that beef is part of the solution and that these topics really are a priority for our industry to continue to improve around. But we also needed to strike a realistic balance and be proactive on these topics if we wanted to continue to be a leader globally in this area of sustainability. So on the next slide, we see our greenhouse gas and carbon sequestration goals. And our first piece was the fact that we want to safeguard the existing 1.5 billion tons of carbon that is stored on lands managed with beef cattle. But not only do we want to safeguard it, we actually want to increase it by sequestering an additional 3.4 million tons of carbon every year. And that number was come to through a meta-analysis of Canadian soil science research that went back over 70 years, looking at the average carbon sequestration rate in Canada, and then applying that to tame pasture across Canada. Research at this point suggests that native grassland in healthy range condition is probably at equilibrium. But we know that there is potential in terms of improving management through grazing practices on those tame pastures. But the big one that we're going to talk about tonight is the goal to reduce primary production greenhouse gas emissions intensity by 33% by 2030. In order to come up with this number, we had a number of scenarios that were developed. We used the baseline from the National Beef Sustainability Assessment and then looked at what could we do under different assumptions, looking at historical trends and if we were able to continue on trend, recognizing that there are diminishing returns for some of those areas, as well as biological limits of the cow. But then we asked, what if there was a major breakthrough in technology or adoption rates? And that 33% reduction is based on the major breakthrough scenario. So we know that this is going to require major investments in research, innovation, and technology transfer in order to achieve it. So on the next slide, I just wanted to show you what this looks like for the US. The US has a clean cow report that assessed the potential to reduce beef's carbon footprint and identified policies that could accelerate the decarbonization of the beef industry. They looked at existing low carbon technologies and practices, including giving cattle in feedlots specialized feed additives that reduce methane emissions, as well as things like composting manure and changing how cattle are grazed. When they included full adoption of those practices by 2030, they looked at a business as usual reductions of about 18%, or 42 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year. They also looked at breakthrough technologies, such as feed additives that could be given not just in the feedlot, but also to grazing cattle, enhanced root crops that could sequester more carbon than conventional plants, as well as breeding of low methane cattle. And some of these were really ambitious as they included technologies that are still in early stages of research. But if those things could be adopted in addition to the existing technologies, they estimated that the carbon footprint of US beef production could fall by about 48%. So on our next slide, we see the scenarios that we did in Canada. And we are comparing against our 2015 baseline. And if advancements stayed on historical trend, that would result in a 17% reduction. But remember, we need a major breakthrough in adoption levels or technology to reach our 33% reduction goal. So how could we get there? We've done some rough estimates on if we were able to use 3NOP, and its brand name is Bovaire, and if there was 100% adoption in backgrounding or finishing, that would reduce emissions by about 8 to 11%. We still have an 8% gap that needs to be addressed by other technologies or adoption levels. We could get some additional improvements from ration changes, about a 2% reduction in the West and a 4 to 5% reduction in the East. That still leaves a 3 to 6% gap that has to come from something else. So whether that's use of Bovaire in total mixed rations for winter feeding of cows, or other solutions and technologies coming forward that could be used on grass, that is potentials for that to happen. But we're still trying to figure out how are we going to meet this goal of a 33% reduction. On this next slide, this is some global research that looked at diet reformulation, specifically feeding of lipids. And you can see in the top there, you've got countries like Brazil and China in the bottom that are really dark. That means they have very high emissions. And if they were to add lipids, they actually come a wee bit lighter, which means they would benefit from that practice. But Canada, we stay the same color in both scenarios. So we actually don't have much of any benefit from feeding lipids or adding that to diets. On the next slide, we see a meta-analysis that was done in 2021, looking at different feed additives to reduce methane emissions. And the top 3 options here are seaweed, fatty acids, and 3NOP or Bovaire. The Beef Cattle Research Council is also conducting research around oregano, tannins, and some of the other things that are lower down on this list. Because as I said, we have a 3 to 6% gap that we still need to fill, and it's got to come from somewhere. So we need to continue to research what mode of action is used by each of these products to understand if there is actually potential of stacking and using multiple strategies in order to reduce emissions, or if they have the same mode of action and they actually just do the same thing. So feeding different things might not have any benefit, or just the same benefit as feeding one. So on the next slide, there was a recent study last fall that was funded by the Global Research Alliance, and it evaluated if 3NOP, freeze-dried asparagophilus, which is also called red algae, nitrates, antibiotic rumen modifiers, essential oil blends, tannins, microalgae, biochar, and others, and they evaluated what the efficacy was of actually all of the different research in this area. And what they found from this long list of different products that they evaluated was that only 3NOP and dried asparagophilus routinely provided an over 20% mitigation of enteric methane. And the confidence level in the research was actually higher for 3NOP than for asparagophilus, as it had more publications currently available. The third most effective item was nitrates, but it delivered a lower mitigation level at only 10% versus the other two at over 20%. All of the other classes of additives could not be expected to deliver even a 10% mitigation level. And so that's why we're talking so much in industry about those two options of 3-NOP and red algae. However, one of the concerns that was noted in the report was the current lack of evidence that any feed additive will increase production or animal performance. And there is a real limitation right now in the research where almost all studies are relying upon the use of a total mixed ration. While there is some interest in other delivery systems that could provide mitigation, particularly on pasture, such as a slow release bolus, it really hasn't been explored to any great extent to have concrete answers of how effective it is. But even more concerning was that no one manufacturer identified the grazing sector as a priority market for methane mitigation products. Right now, all of the focus is on being able to provide something within a total mixed ration in a backgrounding or finishing lot. On the next slide, you're going to see those top 3 options from the report. 3-NOP, Asparagophyllus, and nitrates. And so the first column there is showing that its efficacy in reducing methane is very high for both 3-NOP and Asparagophyllus. There is a large number of academic papers for 3-NOP, and therefore its confidence in its ability to deliver that is high. And they ranked these between 1 as a low and 5 as a high. So that was high for 3-NOP. It was lower for Asparagophyllus just because of the lower number of publications. The other benefit of 3-NOP is that there are no known potential animal welfare risks, as well as no known potential food safety risks at this point, whereas there are some concerns for Asparagophyllus and nitrate. It should be noted that in this report, everything on Asparagophyllus was based on the dried form of the product and not the oil. And current research is being done on the oil, which does have better results. And so that would increase that confidence in efficacy number from a 1 potentially to be higher as they continue to research this product. The other piece is I mentioned the potential for stacking earlier. And right now, all of the research is focused on proving individual products, understanding what the feeding amount would need to be effective and what the reductions in greenhouse gas emissions would be. Once they have that, they'll move on to look at stacking and the additive impacts of feeding more than one additive, but that is very limited at this point in time. So on the next slide, these are the exact same, so they're in the same order. The very top one is your 3-NOP, the second row is your Asparagophyllus, and the bottom row is your nitrates. But what I want to point out here is the potential co-benefits and the fact that 3-NOP and Asparagophyllus do have the potential of improved feed efficiency. And so, as I mentioned earlier, most of the other options explored in this report really weren't able to say that. And so this is why these two are probably the most exciting for industry to be looking at right now. The limitation right now, as noted earlier, is the fact that they're looking at total mixed rations. And there is definitely a need for further development with both products. So on the next slide, they asked a number of questions of cattle managers in order to have a better understanding of if this was even on the radar for producers at this point. And when they asked if managing greenhouse gas emissions was a priority, most responded that it's something that they would be thinking about in 5 to 10 years. And the reasons that they would have for adopting a feed additive in the diet would primarily be around animal performance, potential animal health, and then feed costs, particularly from benefits in feed efficiency. And this is why those questions on the last slide about 3-NOP and Asparagophyllus being able to actually have improvements in feed efficiency and animal performance is so important, is because we understand that it is that that's going to drive adoption for producers moving forward. So on the next slide, we have some results from 3-NOP, which is also called Bovaer. And so it's one of the products that has been the most extensively researched around the world in both backgrounding and finishing diets, with methane reductions of varying levels found in each case. So the bars in orange are for finishing on a high grain ration, whereas the bars in green are backgrounding rations with a high forage component. And one of the things that we're aware of is the fact that this is not approved in Canada yet, and it's probably going to take a while for it to be approved in Canada, whereas it has already been approved in Brazil and Chile and other countries. So on the next slide, you're going to see that one of the largest studies on Bovaer was actually conducted in Canada, and it found up to 82% methane reductions in the study period. But even better was that the feed conversion ratio improved on corn finishing and the barley backgrounding diets. And you should be aware that that 80% reduction was on corn finishing only. It was not on everything. In the backgrounding, the methane reduction was 23%, and for barley finishing, it was 70%. But these are significant reductions that are out there in the Canadian context. So on the next slide, as industry starts talking about feed additives and what's going on out there, I think for any producer, there's some questions that you should be asking. If someone says, would you try this? And I think one of the first ones is asking them, is there a performance benefit? Whether it's an improvement in feed efficiency or conversion ratios, to understand what is the benefit for you and your bottom line. Second is understanding what the mode of action for each product is, and if it has the potential to be stacked with other products that you are already using. And then asking about what the cost benefit analysis is. At this point, a number of these products are being priced differently in the market. And that means that they're not necessarily straightforward in being comparable to each other. So some products are having a reduced price because the manufacturer has already received a carbon credit. Others are being sold at full price to producers, and it's the producer's responsibility to go and see if they have a carbon credit available to them in their jurisdiction that they can sell it for. And that requires having a protocol for, in this case, your province that you could use. And then understanding how is the greenhouse gas reduction recognized? Do you need, as the producer, to be going and applying for the carbon credit? Do you need to be working with an aggregator? And what records do you need to keep in order to be eligible for that? And I think this is one that this is still very early days in talking about these additives, but as things progress, to just be aware that there are definitely some questions that producers should be asking and being aware of. So on the next slide, I have a question for you. Specifically, would you be willing to use a greenhouse gas reduction feed additive? And if that would be at the finishing stage, at the backgrounding sage, maybe you have a total mixed ration that you feed during the winter to your cow-calf operation. Or maybe it's only if there was a feed efficiency benefit, or if there was only a payment or a carbon credit in it for you. So if you can just take a moment and fill that out, we'd love to hear from you.
Alors, à ce moment-ci, on vous invite à cocher les réponses au sondage et on aura là, le résultat dans quelques minutes, quelques secondes.
Oui, je veux aussi ajouter que la réponse au sondage est anonyme, fait que vous ne sentez-vous pas gêné la réponse que vous voulez. Je vais laisser encore quelques secondes de plus pour les laisser aux personnes le temps de répondre une dernière fois. Ok, donc je vais fermer le sondage. Ok, donc.
And there we go. So, and I think that's one of, right now, these results are really interesting, but as we get more information, these things will also be changing. So thank you so much for participating. And our next slide, I just want to come back to some of the ways that our 33% reduction could be achieved, recognizing that feed additives are only one box on this table, that we need to continue to be working in other areas such as reproductive efficiency, as well as improvements in hay yields and feed grain yields, as well as carbon sequestration, because we need to improve in all of these areas in order to reach our goal. And it's not just about feed additives. They are an important part of the story, but they are not the whole story. And remembering that that 17% reduction in terms of continuing on trend needs all of these to be a part of that answer. So next, I would like to talk just for a few minutes here at the end about the Canadian Cow-Calf Cost of Production Network. It was launched in 2021 with 115 producers creating 28 benchmark farms from different production systems across the country. And why is this important? Well, the data required to calculate cost of production and greenhouse gas emissions have a lot of overlap, but also because each production system potentially has different mitigation strategies that will work or not work. We talked at the beginning about how each country is different in terms of their profile of greenhouse gas emissions. And that can actually be the same within a country like Canada, when we have such diversity in environments that producers are working in, but also the diversity in production systems that we see across the country. So on the next slide, you're going to see that we have a master's student at the University of Manitoba. His name is Aaron, and he's working on identifying ways to improve sustainability and profitability of cow-calf operations across Canada. And so he's using the data from our cost of production network, and he's putting all of those numbers into the HOLOS model, which then calculates greenhouse gas emissions. And on the next slide, you're going to see that he's doing baseline greenhouse gas emissions, but in our network, we also created future farm scenarios. We asked producers what would they be looking to make improvements around productivity, reduction in input costs, or improvements in output prices in order to create a future farm scenario of something that they would strive for. And what Aaron's doing is he's looking for win-win scenarios where we have improved competitiveness and profitability on the economic side, but also have reduced greenhouse gas emissions from the environmental side. And so we're looking at the 25 baseline cow-calf farms from last year in order to find what strategies work for different production systems across the country. And so on our last slide, we know that when we're looking to find mitigation options, that we need to be thinking about three things. First is approval of new products. As we think about breakthrough technologies, we need to make sure that they are getting through the system and approved so that they become available for commercial use by producers. And that leads us to the second thing, is adoption, actual adoption by producers of existing and new practices that are shown to reduce emissions within your production system, and that there is actual cost benefit to the producer of adopting. And third is the fact that we need to have continued investment in research, which has provided those incremental improvements over the past and are absolutely necessary moving forward in order to reach our goal.